The splitting of the me in the defense process. Sigmund Freud. The splitting of the me in the defense process. For a moment I find myself in the interesting position of not knowing whether what I am about to say should be regarded as something familiar and long evident or something completely new and surprising. I am inclined to think the latter. I have been struck by the fact that the ego of a person whom we meet as a patient in analysis must have behaved, dozens of years before, when he was young, remarkably in certain peculiar pressure situations. We can fix in general and rather vague terms the situations in which this happens by saying that it occurs under the influence of a psychic trauma. I prefer to select a clearly defined isolated special case, although it certainly does not cover all possible modes of production. Let us suppose, then, that the ego of a child is under the influence of a powerful instinctual demand which it is used to satisfying, and that it is suddenly frightened by an experience which teaches it that the continuation of this satisfaction will bring with it a real, almost intolerable danger. He must then decide either to recognize the real danger, give it the preference and renounce instinctive satisfaction, or to deny reality and pretend to convince himself that there is no danger, so that he can continue with his satisfaction. Thus, there is a conflict between the requirement of instinct and the prohibition by reality. But in practice the child does not take any of these paths, or rather follows both simultaneously, which amounts to the same thing. Reply to the conflict with two opposing reactions and both valid and effective. On the one hand, with the help of certain mechanisms, it rejects reality and refuses to accept any prohibition. On the other hand, at the same time, he recognizes the danger of reality, considers the fear of that danger as a pathological symptom and tries, therefore, to get rid of this fear. It must be confessed that this is a very ingenious solution. The two disputing parties receive their due, instinct is allowed to go on with its satisfaction and reality is shown due respect. But all this has to be paid for one way or another, and this success is achieved at the cost of a tear in the self that never heals, but deepens over time. The two contrary reactions to the conflict persist as the central point of a split of the ego. The whole process seems strange to us because we take for granted the synthesizing nature of ego processes. But here we are clearly wrong. The synthesizing function of the ego, although extremely important, is subject to particular conditions and is exposed to a great number of disturbances. It will help us if we introduce a clinical history into this schematic disquisition. A boy, when he was 3 or 4 years old, came to know the female genitalia when he was seduced by a girl older than him. After these relationships were broken, he continued sexual stimulation by zealously practicing manual masturbation, but he was soon caught in this by his energetic nurse, and threatened with castration, the practice of which was attributed, as usual, to the father. Thus, conditions calculated to produce a tremendous shock effect were present in this case. A castration threat in and of itself doesn't have to make a big impression. A child will refuse to believe it because he cannot easily imagine the possibility of losing such a highly valued part of his body. His early vision of the female genitalia might have convinced the child in question of such a possibility. But he did not deduce this conclusion from it because his deviation to do so was too great and there was no reason that could force him to do so. On the contrary, if he felt any fear, it was calmed by the reflection that what the girl lacked would appear later, she would grow a penis later. Anyone who has watched quite a few small children will remember encountering these considerations at the sight of a little sister's genitalia. But it is different if the two factors occur together. In this case, the threat revives the memory of the perception that until then has been considered harmless and finds the feared confirmation in that memory. Now the boy thinks he understands why the girl's genitals showed no sign of a penis, and no longer dares to doubt that his own genitals may follow the same fate. From then on he cannot help but believe in the reality of the danger of castration. The usual result of castration fear, the result that is regarded as normal, is that, either immediately or after considerable struggle, the boy accepts the threat and obeys the prohibition, either completely or at least in part. I.e., he does not continue to touch his genitals with his hand. In other words, give up, in whole or in part, the satisfaction of the instinct. However, we can accept that our patient will find another way. He created a substitute for the penis that he missed in females, that is, a fetish. By doing so, it is true that he was denying reality, but he had saved his own penis. As long as he was not forced to admit that the women had lost their penises, he had no need to believe the threat that had been made to him. He did not have to fear for his own penis and thus could safely continue his masturbation. This behavior of our patient calls our attention because it is a rejection of reality, a procedure that we prefer to reserve for psychoses. And in practice it is not much different. But we will stop our judgment, because on closer inspection we will discover an important difference. The boy did not simply contradict his perceptions and create the hallucination of a penis where there was none. He only performed a displacement of values. He transferred the importance of the penis to another part of the body, a procedure in which he was aided by the mechanism of regression, in a way that does not need to be explained. This displacement was related only to the female body. As for his own penis, nothing had changed. This way of dealing with reality, which almost deserves to be described as refined, was decisive with regard to the boy's practical conduct. He continued with his masturbation as if there was no danger to his penis, but at the same time, in complete contradiction to his apparent intrepidity or indifference, he developed a symptom with which, despite everything, he recognized danger. He had been threatened with castration by his father, and immediately afterwards, concurrent with the creation of his fetish, developed an intense fear that his father would punish him, which required all the strength of his masculinity to dominate and hypercompensate for him. This fear of his father was silent on the castration subject. Aided by regression to an oral phase, it assumed the form of a fear of being eaten by his father. At this point it is impossible to forget a primitive fragment of Greek mythology that tells how Kronos, the old father god, devoured his children and tried to devour his youngest son Zeus like the others, and how he was saved by the force from his mother and castrated his father afterwards. But, returning to our case, we must add that the child also produced another symptom that, although it was mild, he kept to this day. It was an anxious susceptibility to the fact that any of his toes was touched, as if in all that swing of denial and acceptance it was castration, however, the one that found a clearer expression. And the splitting of the me in the defense process. Sigmund Freud.